She stood by the narrow window, watching the relentless grey rain fall over the vast, imposing estate of Kenninghall, feeling trapped. The cold stone walls were not designed to keep enemies out, but to keep the lady of the house firmly within. Elizabeth Stafford was the daughter of a duke, yet here, under the invisible chains of the law, she was merely property. It was the year 1533, a time when the world was ruled by the whims of powerful men. In the eyes of the church and the state, a woman ceased to exist the very moment she spoke her vows. Her legal identity was instantly swallowed by her husband, her body, her fortune, and her voice becoming entirely his to command. Elizabeth had entered this union with the pride of her lineage, believing her high birth would shield her from domestic tyranny. She was the daughter of the Duke of Buckingham, a woman of royal blood, accustomed to deference, respect, and a certain autonomy. But Thomas Howard, the third Duke of Norfolk, saw not a partner in her, but an acquisition to be managed. The vast halls of the Howard estate were filled with the whispers of servants who watched her with pity and suspicion. Every candle that burned, every piece of bread she ate, and every gown she wore belonged legally to the Duke alone. She possessed nothing, not even the rights to her own children, who were being molded into strangers by his influence. The cruelty began not with a raised fist, but with the slow, calculated erosion of her standing within her own household. Thomas brought his mistress, a woman named Bess Holland, into their shared home, forcing Elizabeth to dine with her rival. It was a humiliation designed to break her spirit, a psychological siege laid against her dignity day after day, year after year. When Elizabeth dared to speak against this indignity, the law of England rose up like a fortress to protect her husband. He was the head of the household, his authority absolute, his right to discipline his wife enshrined in centuries of precedent. There was no police force to call, no magistrate who would listen, for a wife complaining of her husband was anarchy. The atmosphere at Kenninghall grew toxic, a suffocating fog of silence and averted eyes that left Elizabeth isolated in a crowd. She would sit at the long wooden table, the candlelight flickering on the jewels that she wore but did not own. Bess Holland sat across from her, draped in the Duke's favor, while the legitimate wife was treated like an unwanted ghost. The Duke's method was not chaotic rage, but a chillingly structured campaign to strip Elizabeth of her sanity and her resolve. He cut off her allowance, leaving her unable to tip the servants, effectively rendering her powerless in the economy of the house. Without money, she could not command loyalty, she could not send letters, and she could not maintain the appearance of her rank. Isolation tightened around her throat like a noose, the silence of the countryside amplifying the screaming quiet of her lonely chambers. She began to notice that her letters were being intercepted, the wax seals broken and resealed by hands that were not hers. Every word she wrote to her brother or the king's secretary was read by the Duke, analyzed for rebellion, and suppressed. The psychological weight of this surveillance created a paranoia that made sleep impossible and turned every shadow into a lurking spy. She was living in a panopticon of her husband's making, where his gaze was omnipresent, even when he was miles away at court. He wanted her to feel that resistance was futile, that his power was as inevitable as the tides or the sunrise. Then came the moment that shattered whatever fragile hope she had left of maintaining her position through stoic endurance and silence. During a confrontation in the great hall, the mistress, emboldened by the Duke's protection, physically attacked the Duchess in a rage. Elizabeth expected the household to rush to her aid, for the natural order to assert itself and defend the high-born lady. Instead, the servants stood frozen, terrified of the Duke's wrath, watching as the mistress struck the wife with impunity and scorn. When Thomas entered, he did not punish the aggressor, but turned his cold, reptilian stare upon the bleeding, weeping Elizabeth. He blamed her for the disturbance, citing her jealousy as the cause of the chaos, twisting reality until she questioned her mind. This was the weaponization of reality, a gaslighting tactic centuries before the term existed, designed to make her feel insane. He ordered her confined to her chambers, not for her protection, but to remove the problem from his sight and mind. The lock clicked shut, a sound that echoed with the finality of a prison sentence, sealing her away from the world. For weeks she remained in that room, the walls closing in, her only company the changing light on the floorboards. She was denied visitors, her contact with the outside world severed, her existence reduced to square footage of her bedroom. The psychological toll was immense. She paced the floor until her feet ached, her mind racing through loops of despair and anger. It was during this confinement that the deepest betrayal was orchestrated, a knife twisted into her heart by her own flesh. Her son, Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey, a poet and a soldier, was the light of her life. The Duke, knowing this, worked systematically to poison the young man's mind against his mother, painting her as a hysterical burden. Henry, ambitious and dependent on his father for his future inheritance, made the cold calculation to align with the power. He stopped visiting her door, stopped sending inquiries to her health, and eventually openly sided with the mistress against her. To see her beloved son laugh with the woman who tormented her was a pain far worse than any physical blow. Elizabeth realized then that the law of coverture had not just taken her property, it had stolen her children's love. She was a non-entity in their future, a relic to be discarded, while the father held the keys to their destiny. The realization broke something fundamental inside her, a collapse of the maternal bond that had been her last emotional anchor. Desperation drove her to write letters that still survive today, scrawled in a frantic hand that betrays her unraveling state. She wrote to Thomas Cromwell, the king's right hand, begging not for justice, but for the basic means to survive. "I have not money to buy myself a pair of hose," she confessed, the humiliation of the admission burning on the page. The Duke had reduced a duchess to a beggar, forcing her to plead with strangers for the dignity of clothing. He responded to her complaints with cold indifference, claiming he provided her with everything she needed, painting her as ungrateful. It was a masterclass in public relations, destroying her reputation at court while he played the role of the long-suffering husband. She was eventually banished to a smaller, more remote house, a place that felt less like a home and more like exile. Here, the isolation was absolute. The muddy roads were impassable in winter, cutting her off from the news of London. She was allowed a pitiful allowance, barely enough to feed her reduced household, keeping her in a state of perpetual anxiety. The seasons turned, marking the passing of time on a face that had once been celebrated for its noble beauty. Her hair grayed not from age alone, but from the stress of a life lived in a state of constant siege. She learned to live with the silence, finding a grim resilience in the refusal to die or to go mad. Even in exile, the Duke's control was felt. He dictated who could visit her and what books she could read. He sent spies to report on her mood, her words, and her health, waiting for the day she would succumb. But Elizabeth Stafford possessed a core of iron. She refused to give him the satisfaction of her death or her silence. She chronicled her suffering, creating a record of the domestic tyranny that the law sanctioned and the church ignored. Her letters became her resistance, a way to assert that she still existed, that she was still a thinking, feeling human being. "I am a true woman," she wrote, a simple declaration that carried the weight of a scream against the system that erased her. The years dragged on, a slow torture of wasted potential and enforced idleness, the days bleeding into a gray haze. She heard of the Duke's political maneuvers, his role in the downfall of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, with a distant horror. She knew better than anyone the coldness of the man who sent his nieces to the block without a tear. The cruelty she endured was a microcosm of the violence he inflicted on the nation, a domestic mirror of his tyranny. Yet, the world saw him as a great statesman, a peer of the realm, while she was just the difficult wife. This injustice burned in her, a quiet fire that kept her warm through the freezing winters of her lonely, crumbling house. As the king's health failed and the political landscape shifted, Elizabeth watched from afar, a spectator in her own century. She saw her son Henry arrested and executed for treason, a victim of the very ambition the Duke had cultivated in him. The grief was complicated by the estrangement, a bitter mourning for the boy he was, not the man he became. When the news of her son's death reached her, she did not weep, for her tears had been spent years ago in that locked room. She sat in her chair, looking out at the same rain that had fallen for decades, feeling the heavy, crushing weight of waste. The law had allowed her husband to destroy their family, to consume their children, and to leave her with nothing but ghosts. Finally, the wheel of fortune turned, and the Duke himself fell from grace, arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London. For the first time in decades, the fear that had ruled her life began to recede, replaced by a strange, hollow calm. She did not rejoice in his fall, for the damage to her soul was already done, irreparable and etched deep. Elizabeth Stafford lived to see the death of the husband who had been her jailer, her tormentor, and her legal owner. When he died, she was finally legally a person again, a widow, entitled to her jointure and her own identity. But the freedom came too late to restore the years lost to the darkness, to the silence, and to the fear. She spent her final years attempting to rebuild the fragments of her life, reclaiming her status, but the scars remained visible. She walked with a slight stoop, the physical manifestation of the heavy psychological burden she had carried for so long. Her eyes held a haunted look, a wariness that never truly left her, even when she was safe in her own home. History has often remembered Elizabeth as a shrew, a nagging woman who failed to please her powerful, important husband. This narrative is the final insult, a propaganda victory for the system that sought to silence her while she lived. We must look back and see her not as a difficult wife, but as a survivor of a legal form of slavery. She was a political prisoner in her own marriage, a woman who fought a totalitarian regime of one man with only her voice. Her story is a testament to the thousands of women whose names are lost, crushed under the weight of the law of coverture. Elizabeth Stafford stood in the rain, battered but unbroken, a witness to the truth that the most dangerous prison was the home. The silence that followed the Duke's imprisonment was not the silence of peace, but of a battlefield cleared of bodies. Elizabeth walked the halls of the house that was finally hers, touching the cold stone, feeling no warmth or victory. The trauma of 20 years does not vanish simply because the oppressor has been removed from the seat of power. She found herself flinching at the sound of heavy footsteps, her body remembering the fear her mind tried to forget. Even with the Duke in the Tower of London, waiting for the axe, his shadow stretched long across the English countryside. There was a profound pressure placed upon her during his trial to plead for his life, to play the dutiful wife. But Elizabeth Stafford made the most radical choice of her life. She chose to remain absolutely, devastatingly silent. She refused to write to the king on his behalf, refusing to use her influence to save the man who broke her. By doing nothing, she shouted to the world that his life was no longer her burden, his fate no longer her concern. When the news came that he would not be executed but kept in prison, she felt a complex, heavy ripple of emotion. He would live, rotting in a cell just as she had rotted in the country, a poetic justice that felt hollow. She realized that his death would not restore her youth, nor would it bring back the son he had turned against her. Her health began to fail rapidly in the years of her freedom, the physical toll of chronic stress finally collecting its due. She spent her days in a quiet routine, finding solace in the simple freedoms of choosing her own food and sleep. Yet the letters she wrote reveal a woman who was deeply lonely, scarred by the betrayal of her family who had abandoned her. The world moved on without her. The court was filled with new faces who knew her only as a relic of the past. She was the old Duchess, a living ghost, a cautionary tale whispered in the corridors by young women who feared her fate. Elizabeth spent her final energies securing her legacy, ensuring that the small property she reclaimed would go to those she chose. As the winter of 1558 approached, Elizabeth took to her bed, her strength fading with the dying light. She did not fear death. To a woman who had lived under the tyranny of Thomas Howard, the grave held no terror. It promised a final release from the memories, a quiet darkness where no one could intercept her letters or mock her pain. She died on the last day of November, buried quickly and efficiently without a grand state funeral to mark her passing. It is a final, bitter irony that she was laid to rest in the Howard vault beside the ancestors of her tormentor. Even in death, she was geographically bound to the family that had treated her as a broodmare and a hostage. The historians of the following centuries wrote of the Duke's military victories, dismissing Elizabeth as hysterical and difficult. They adopted the abuser's narrative completely, framing her rational reaction to cruelty as a defect in her character. This historical gaslighting denied her the dignity of her suffering, continuing the abuse long after her body had turned to dust. We must strip away the layers of Tudor propaganda to see the woman standing in the center of the storm. She was a whistleblower of domestic tyranny, documenting the abuse in an era that had no language for such concepts. Her letters are not the ravings of a madwoman, but the depositions of a witness testifying against a crime against humanity. Elizabeth Stafford's life was a tragedy, yes, but it was also a triumph of the human will to endure against odds. She survived the wrath of one of the most dangerous men in English history, and she outlived him to see the sun rise. She died free, a status that she fought for with every breath, a victory that no historian can take away from her. By remembering her now, we break the silence that was imposed upon her, granting her the agency she was owed. Let us leave her not in darkness, but sitting by a window, writing a letter that she knows will be finally safe. It is a small victory in the grand sweep of time, but for Elizabeth Stafford, that small freedom was her entire world.